All right, I hope we're live. I think we're live. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our weekly concert series. We are again at our monthly performance and interview here at McMiniman's, the Spanish Ballroom in Tacoma, Washington. And if you've been watching us do these for a while, it looks a little different. We're trying something different today, and hopefully it will improve everything. So, but we're here today joined by the wonderful pianist and composer and educator, the great Dan Kramlich. Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, this has been a long time coming, so I'm glad we could do this today. You've been around playing on the Seattle scene for quite some time and teaching for quite some time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those, I mean, many musicians know of you and your reputation and your expertise, but for people that don't know much about you, how did you get started playing music?
I grew up here in Seattle, and I was really fortunate that my parents got me into music. I started screwing around on their piano in the house when I was very young, and my mom had the foresight to find somebody who would teach somebody so young, and got into music at a very early age, and then like a lot of students do, quit when I was 10 or 11 or something, discovered other interests, and was brought back into music by my middle school band director, who's a great musician in town, Jake Bergevin. And that's when I was introduced to jazz music and this idea that you don't necessarily have to play all of the little black dots on the page exactly how the composer laid out for you, and that was really appealing to me, and haven't left music since then.
Well, going back further, so before you started, just tinkering on the piano, did your parents, were they music aficionados?
My dad is not. My dad loves music. He's not a musician. He calls himself tone deaf, and I'll give him some more credit than that. But he was really into bands like Steely Dan and Dire Straits and that kind of stuff, so that's what I was listening to in the car all the time when we were driving around, which has been a bit of an inspiration too. My mom was a talented musician as a youngster, and played the piano, sang in the church choir, played oboe in high school orchestra, that kind of thing. But neither of them really pursued music. Well, certainly my dad didn't, but my mom didn't really pursue music after graduating from college.
Okay. And so you say you grew up here. I'm assuming you grew up in Seattle, correct?
Yeah, just north of Seattle. Sorry, in it was unincorporated Snohomish County, so near Mill Creek and Bothell and that sort of area. And then I ended up going to Mount Lake Terrace High School.
And middle school, just for because I mean, this area has a huge history of great music schools or schools that have good music programs, particularly for jazz. So where did you attend middle school?
So middle school was at a school called Terrace Park, which was a K-8 school, and Jake was the band director there for a few years before. He's been at Edmonds Woodway for probably 20 years now, I think. But before that, he was at that Terrace Park school. And I was actually in the first grade. It was an elementary school, and I was in the first year cohort of kids that occupied the school as it expanded to 7th and then eventually 8th grade. So yeah, that was where, like I said, I got into playing jazz music. And actually, I was playing drums and mallet percussion in the jazz band, and not piano. I didn't get back into piano for several years after that.
This is not a barbed question. I'm not a dig at all. I'm just curious.
Okay.
I'm curious how old you are. When were you born?
I'm turning 40 in a couple weeks, so I was born in 1982.
Okay, so we're roughly. I'm 78, so we're roughly the same. I'm just trying to. The reason I'm asking this, I wanted to figure out maybe who were some of the students in your sphere of influence when you were younger and learning how to play. Was there anybody you remember?
There were so many great young musicians in the area, especially in my high school years. So in my school actually were in my same class were Mike Dorr, who was a great trumpet player, and Ahamefule Aluo, who's a great trumpet player and multi-instrumentalist and musician and composer. Expanding that a little further, in my school district was the saxophonist Steve Treseler, and we played a lot together as kids. We played in a trad jazz band with him and Mike Dorr and a few other people called Rise and Shine that we toured with a little bit. And then the Seattle schools at Roosevelt, there were so many great trumpet players especially. So at Roosevelt, Jumani Smith was there, who's now playing lead with Michael Bublé's band, and Cesar Amaral. And at Garfield, Ann Drummond was there, and Tatum Greenblatt and Josh Deutsch, and just there are tons of incredible musicians that I was fortunate enough to be able to hang out with a little bit and absorb a lot of things from.
Sure. Now, I'm assuming with Jake as an instructor, because he's been on the scene and gigging and knowing everybody for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
He looks very young. Still, kudos, Jake.
Yep.
I'm assuming when you were younger and at least under his, sphere of influence, were there places to play that you could put groups together and things, or did he get you out in the community playing? Or
Not quite at that age. Once I got into high school, I just went to a lot of jam sessions. There was a jam session in those days at Tula's on Sunday nights that was all ages, and I was there as soon as I got my driver's license. And I was pretty young for my grade in school, so this was summer after my sophomore year. As soon as I got my driver's license, I was at Tula's every Sunday, and over the course of the couple of years I was going there, it was always either Mark Seals or Eric Verlinde or John Hansen who was hosting the session. And I just made sure to get there every Sunday night. There really, especially up in the north end where I was living, there wasn't much going on as far as live music, as far as I could tell, and so I had to make that trip to Belltown, which was not as much of an ordeal back then as it is now. But there was a lot more parking, and it was cheaper, and Tula's was nice enough to let me stick around until 10 o'clock when they had to kick the miners out.
Right. Okay. Well, so studying with Jake in school, working on stuff, and you said Mountain Lake Terrace.
Mm-hmm.
You said you took lessons. Who were some of the first teachers that you remember working with?
So when I was a kid, I didn't take piano lessons at all. When I came back to music, I took percussion lessons. So my first percussion teacher was Chris Monroe, who's still a great drummer and percussionist who plays the theater circuit a lot. He plays at the Fifth Avenue Theater and places like that. He's a great musician, and he's the first one who kind of got me interested in jazz vibraphone. And then after that, I took lessons from a guy named Ian Alvarez, who was a great again, percussionist and educator. He was actually an elementary school teacher up in my school district, and but on the side taught a lot of percussion lessons. So I played in a group with him called the Cascade Percussion Ensemble that was associated with the Cascade Symphony, which is a community orchestra up there. And our lessons were primarily classical mallet percussion stuff, but we would, he knew I was really interested in jazz and that I was hacking around on piano in the jazz band, and so he introduced me to a bunch of jazz stuff too that I'm really grateful for. I had one jazz piano lesson before I went to college, and it was with Barney McClure.
Oh, okay.
And so I just had a one-off lesson with him and soaked up a whole lot in just an hour with that guy.
Yes. For I don't even know if he's still around. I'd love to get him.
He's in
to
Palm Springs now, I
Okay,
think. But
okay.
he was the mayor of Port Townsend, and
Yes.
that's why all that jazz stuff goes on out there. And then after I had my lesson with him, he moved to Fairbanks and lived up there for a while. And then I heard he was down where it was a little warmer in Palm Springs.
I don't blame him. I don't blame him.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, so then Mountain Lake Terrace, and then from there, what happened? Hang on a minute.
Okay.
So you're at Mountain Lake Terrace, and you mentioned all these great musicians that were around, Roosevelt and Garfield.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, did they take the band on any trips or anything, or have any? Let's go with that first.
Yeah, sure. So I went all over the place with the high school jazz band. We were fortunate enough to make it to the Essentially Ellington competition. I want to say it was my senior year of high school. So along with Garfield and Roosevelt and whatever school Paul Harshman was teaching at the time, I think it was Shorewood. So me and a bunch of those people that I mentioned were out there in New York for a week, and got to play at a jam session at Birdland and do all of that kind of stuff. We also did a lot of the local jazz festivals that people tend to do around here. So we played the Lionel Hampton Festival in Idaho. We did the Reno Jazz Festival a couple times. Just that kind of local stuff. But yeah, I was really fortunate. We had 2 trips to New York with that group, and it was. Yeah, it was great to be able to get outside of the town a little bit, and as well as playing a bunch of gigs in the community that, a lot of times high school jazz bands are called for. So the big one, I was just thinking about this as I was in downtown Seattle the other day, but we played at the opening ceremony for the little outdoor area at Benaroya Hall, which is called the Garden of Remembrance.
Yeah.
So.
Cool. Mm-hmm. I also wanted to ask, too, because I remember myself just being in school, whether it was a high school, college, they'd bring in different musicians who would be in town. I know Seattle, there's a lot of people that would come to and play Jazz Alley and then maybe go work at a high school or college, and I've just myself, I remember like vividly like certain things that I've learned from watching those types of things. So when you were at Mount Lake Terrace, did they bring any guest artists in that were like formative for you?
Yeah, they certainly, mostly local guys, honestly. But I remember in association with that Essentially Ellington Festival, they sent out clinicians to work with us before we went to the festival in New York. And the drummer, Adam Nussbaum, was one of those people. And so that was, even though I wasn't playing the drums in the band, I was a drummer, and that was really influential for me. As far as local guys, I remember Tom Marriott coming in. He was, you know, probably in his mid-20s at that time, but he seemed a lot wiser than that, and he probably was. I learned a ton from him, and speaking of much older guys, I remember Don Lamphere coming in once, and that was really influential as well, just being able to hang out with a guy. You know, I was a little too young to really spend a lot of time with Don, but to be able to hang out with him a couple times when he came to the school, and you know, hear stories about him talking about hanging out with Charlie Parker and all that kind of stuff was pretty mind-boggling for, you know, 16-year-old me.
No, I was very fortunate. I actually studied with him when I was in college. I like once a month, you know. A little older, like I said, not much. But what I enjoyed about Don was he had his concepts figured out, and he could teach them to you very. Like some people are great players, and maybe getting the information translated when they're doing a lesson doesn't come off quite as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not true of everybody, but he was an excellent musician and an excellent teacher in how he could convey the ideas and make them easily digestible for a student.
Yeah,
I think.
I remember. No, he was, and like I said, I only got to work with him a couple of times, but he was really great at communicating at whatever level, well, at the level that I was at the time, wherever that was. He was able to reach me for sure.
And I think it's funny that you mentioned the, excuse me, Adam Nussbaum, because I remember him coming to Cornish when I was in college. So maybe this was maybe
could
this
have
might
been the
have been the same
trip.
thing.
Yeah, it would have been like February of 2000 or something.
Yeah, somewhere around there. And I remember the thing that I remember the most about that, and that's why I was asking, you know, because all the artists that have come through, I remember like vividly certain things that they have said, and they've stuck with me over the years. But he was talking about just being ready for things. And the story that he talked about was, and maybe he told the same story with you guys, but he was living in New York, and right around the club, right around the street from the entrance to this club that I can't remember the name of the club, but he had been listening to all of Joe Henderson's recordings and albums, and he knew all of this stuff. So someone called him and said, "Hey, can you sub for this gig with Joe Henderson?" He's like, "Yes, of course." And he went and he was ready for the gig because he knew all of the music already. And he's like, his point was, don't wait. If there's artists that you like, learn all of their material. So if the opportunity arises, you're ready for the thing. So.
I heard the same thing a few years ago from a different drummer, from Ignacio Baroa, who said the same thing about Dizzy Gillespie's music and how he got called to sub for Dizzy, and he already knew all the tunes, so he was ready to go.
Cool. All right. So Mountain Lake Terrace, you're hanging out with great musicians, playing, getting some stuff together. So what happened after Mountain Lake Terrace?
So, well, shout out to Darren Fall first of all, because he was the band director at Mountain Lake Terrace, and he came in the middle of my sophomore year and was right out of college and was not a jazz person really, but he like took the bull by the horns, and he's one of the great band directors now for jazz stuff in the area. So watching somebody who was not that much older than me come in and be open to new experiences and open to learning how to do something like that was really influential as well, I think. But after that, so the head of the music in the whole Edmond School District at the time was this guy, Frank DeMiro, who was a kind of a vocal jazz legend. And I was talking to him about colleges and where I should go, and we didn't have a ton of money to be going to a conservatory or anything. And so he hooked me up with Steve Treseler, who was a great vocal jazz director, but he thought of Steve Treseler because he was a pianist, a jazz pianist as well. And he taught at Western Michigan University. And so I went out there to, like, I sent in an audition tape, and they had me come out and meet everybody in person, and I went out and I played a bit for Dr. Treseler, and just kind of loved the place. It felt like home from the time that I got there, and everybody was so, your stereotypical upper Midwest welcoming politeness kind of stuff. Everybody was eager to chat and teach me and learn from me if they could, and all that kind of stuff. And I had a great connection with Dr. Zagri, and I knew that I needed somebody who would push me a little bit, and I knew that he would do that. And there's some other places I looked at, I wasn't so sure. Like, there were places with great teachers maybe, but people that weren't quite intense enough to get me prodded in the right direction. And so I didn't even end up going to any other schools to audition or anything. I just ended up going to Western Michigan in Kalamazoo, and that was great for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because Kalamazoo, it's similar to Tacoma maybe, in that it's a big enough town that there were gigs. There was a little bit of a jazz scene, but it wasn't a big enough town that there were a lot of professional musicians living there. It was 2 hours from Chicago and 2 hours from Detroit. So most people, even if they were from Kalamazoo or Grand Rapids, once they got out of school, they moved to one of those places. And that left a lot of work for the college students that were there. So I got to play a lot of gigs.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Right on. Well, I want to go back a minute because you were doing percussion. How did you end up going for piano? When did the switch take over to piano?
So yeah, I realized I had to choose one or the other, and honestly, I knew that there was more work for pianists, and I knew I wanted to work in music somehow, and I knew that if I wanted to go with vibraphone, it's great. I love that instrument, and it's a noble profession being a vibraphonist. But it's a lot harder to get work. Like, everybody needs a pianist. There aren't too many people, singers getting gigs and going, oh, who am I going to call to play vibraphone to back me up? And there's not a lot of solo vibraphone gigs. So I auditioned on percussion at Western, and just ended up sticking with piano. Yeah. But yeah, I keep telling my wife that my midlife crisis purchase is going to be a vibraphone. It's not. I don't need a sports car.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me go back to. I wanted to ask about some of your early influences with jazz. I mean, we could say music in general. Let's go with just music in general. So,
Sure.
when you first started getting interested in music and excited about music and playing and learning, who were some groups or musicians that you liked?
Yeah. So that was jazz, honestly, because I listened to music, like I said, with my dad in the car or whatever, and I didn't mind music, and I liked Steely Dan and Genesis and that kind of stuff. But I wasn't really passionate about it. And then I got into jazz and for whatever reason got hooked. And honestly, it was all I knew that existed was big band stuff, because that's what we were doing at school. And then my grandparents came over one time, and they were of the swing era, and they were probably born in the late 20s or early 30s or something. And they brought me, some like Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw records, and I had never heard anything like that before. And so it was, for some reason, that stuff was really captivating to me. And then, a few years later, when I figured out, oh, you can play jazz, you don't need 17 people to play jazz music, and that piano is more at the forefront maybe when you have smaller groups. Then I got into some other stuff. But my first love with jazz music was the big band stuff. And then, I didn't really get super passionate about any small group jazz stuff. I thought it was interesting until I got to college and started meeting other people there and listening to a lot more modern stuff. And so I got hooked on whoever the hot new pianists were in the early 2000s. So I listened to a bunch of Brad Meldau, and the Bad Plus was just becoming a thing at that time, and that was just anything that was super unique like that and caught my ear. Yeah. So, yeah, it's my listening interest. I have a new favorite musician every 4 months, it seems like, that I just really dig into, and then I move on to something else. Yeah. But the first really formative ones, I'd say, were probably Keith Jarrett and Herbie's stuff, Blue Note stuff from the 60s, and then Brad.
Okay, all right. I'm glad you mentioned this because this interview is going to go all over the place. I
Okay.
don't have any, but and I don't get out. You know, I'm always working, and I don't get out as much as I would like to go see things. It's very rare, but I know that you have this band, and I've been wanting to see it for a long time. And then there's pandemic, which didn't help. But it's the Grunge Trio, and the thing that's hilarious to me is. In the last couple months, I've had some friends, and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna put this band together and do 90s rock tunes." And then I've heard other people, they're like, "Oh, that's a cool concept." And I'm like, "Well, guys, there's been this band that's been around for like 20 years doing this." So, and it's the Dan Kramlich Grunge project.
The Grunge Trio, yeah. We just
Can
call
you
it the
talk
Grunge
about
Trio.
that a little bit, please?
Yeah. So this is, well, I'll take you way back just to bring you to the genesis of the whole thing. So, I was in a cohort of kids in elementary school that we were in the same class so it wasn't like your traditional elementary school where you go from 3rd to 4th grade and then you're in a whole new class with maybe a bunch of new people. I was with the same people for 4 or 5 years in a row. Yeah. And one of the members of that group of kids wanted to put together a reunion. This is like 2011 or 2012 or something. And they knew I was a musician, and they were like, "Hey, will you come and play a bunch of music from when we were in elementary school?" You know, so we're talking 92, 93. So I said okay, and I put a little band together, and we played at Full Tilt Ice Cream in White Center of all places. And I just looked at the Billboard charts from 92, 93, 94, and I put together a bunch of arrangements of those tunes, and most of them were awful. Like we played, we played Ace of Base, and we played Linger by the Cranberries, and we played, like, whatever was on the radio at that time, or Tears in Heaven, the Clapton tune.
I like that too.
Yeah, it's a good one. But I realized that like the grunge stuff that I like, the Soundgarden and the Nirvana and the Pearl Jam stuff, like, actually kind of worked. So then I had never really listened to that music that much because. By the time I was the age where I was really getting into music, like, Kurt Cobain had already died, and it was kind of moving on to the next pop thing, and I was becoming kind of a jazz nerd. So I really dug into that music and listened to a bunch of Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam and all that stuff, and found the tunes that I thought worked, and made a bunch of arrangements. And yeah, we've been playing probably 10 years now, on and off.
It's funny to me, everyone has opinions, and everyone's entitled to his opinions. It's not right or wrong, but people say, "Oh, well, there's just, jazz is so much more harmonically complex, and you can't really do that kind of as much stuff with the rock tunes." It's like, well, wait a minute. If you look at McCoy Tyner's Passion Dance, there's only one chord, you
Right.
know. So why not?
Yeah.
So it's just more about being creative and making something cool with whatever the template might be. And I remember the first time I heard. It was a Charlie Hunter album, Bing Bing Bing, and they did a Nirvana tune on there.
Okay.
And that was the first time I'd ever heard like jazz and like
Oh.
more modern rock put together.
Yeah, the one for me, and this is back in high school, that I listened to was Herbie came out with an album called The New Standard in 96 or something, I want to say, and it had Michael Brecker on it. And but they did all kinds of stuff. They did a Beatles tune, the Norwegian Wood, I think, and they did which Nirvana tune did they do? All Apologies, I think. And so it's not my idea that, like, we can update the jazz repertoire a little bit, because I think my whole philosophy on it is that, like, Miles didn't play Surrey with a Fringe on Top because it was a really great tune. He played it because it was popular at the time, and now we're all still playing that because it was popular 70 years ago because Miles did it. But if Miles were around now, he wouldn't be playing pop tunes from the 50s. He'd be playing pop tunes from now, and that's, he played Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time in the late 80s, and he was into Prince and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I love the old standards too, and I play those all the time, and that's some of my favorite music to play. But it's cool when you play tunes and the audience recognizes them, which is not something that happens that often with jazz music, for me anyway, because the tunes just aren't popular, and I think a lot of people like them and appreciate the music and all of that, but it's cool when you can play something and people recognize the melody and they can kind of hear what you're doing.
Definitely. Well, who was the personnel for the band? Was it Max Wood on drums?
So now it is Max Wood on drums, and it is Chris Seimer on bass. Originally, it was Chuck Kissler on bass, who no longer is really playing, and great drummer named Mark DeFlorio, who lived in town for a short time. I think he's living in Europe somewhere now, but he was a fantastic drummer, and super versatile. But anyway, yeah, now it's Max Wood and Chris Seimer, and I love the way both of them play and how open they are. It seems like certain tunes in that book, like every time we play them, they're just completely different, and they're okay with that, and they're able to just hear whatever's going on, and they're willing to go in whatever direction that is, and that makes it a really rewarding kind of experience to play with that group.
At this point, because I knew you've been doing it for a long time, which is when, like I said, it was hilarious to me when someone said, "Oh, this is a great concept. It's a new thing." It's like, no. Anyways, how big is the book at this point that you guys have assembled?
It's not that big. I've got 25 tunes in the book, maybe, and usually, like, we stretch them out. So usually, if we have a 2-hour gig, we're probably only going to play 12 tunes. And there are some of them that we play more often than not. There's some that we play pretty much every gig. We play the Pearl Jam tune "Elderly Woman Behind the Counter in a Small Town" almost every gig. We play "Rooster" by the Alice in Chains almost every gig. And there are some that we sprinkle in here and there. I remember when Soundgarden in 2013 or 14 came out with a new album called King Animal, and there's some great stuff on there, and I transcribed a couple of those tunes, and we have those in the book, but I realized, going back to what I was saying earlier, like, nobody knows those tunes. So it's like we're playing Soundgarden tunes, but people are, I'm sure it's like when Soundgarden went on tour and people were like, "Play Black Hole Sun," you know? Yeah. So we don't play those as much. But yeah, I think it's about 25 tunes right now.
Cool. Are there plans of adding more to the book, or?
Maybe. We used to play, one of our steady gigs used to be at the Jazz Festival out in Ellensburg, and the band Screaming Trees is from there. Yeah. And so people were always asking us to play Screaming Trees tunes. So I'm always kind of going back to that stuff and digging around to see. Some of it just, I don't feel translates really well to my trio concept. I'm sure somebody could do something with some of those tunes that don't really hit for me, but it's not me. But every once in a while, I'll listen to something that I haven't heard before, and I'll go, well, maybe I can do something with that. And so I'll add a tune every once in a while.
Well, aside from that, because I know you do lots of other things, what are some other projects that you're involved with that you're playing and working on stuff?
Right now, I've really slowed down doing new creative stuff when the pandemic hit, which is too bad. But but I decided to focus most of my energy on the parenting stuff, which was necessary at the time.
Son or daughter?
Yeah, I have an 8-year-old son.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
He'll be 9 in a couple months. He's pretty great. But let's see. So right now I do I just dig into random stuff every once in a while. So actually I'm playing at this series called Piano Starts Here at the Royal Room in a couple weeks, and for those who don't know the series, it's quarterly, I think. I haven't done it before, but they have a theme every time of a couple of different composers or pianists or whatever. So the theme this time is Herbie Hancock and Joe Zawinul. And so I've been digging into a bunch of the old Cannonball Adderley stuff that Joe Zawinul was on, and trying to transcribe some of his tunes from back then. And that's been pretty entertaining. He wrote some pretty good stuff. I recently started playing a background music solo piano gig at an office building in downtown Seattle. So I'm trying to, usually I just play tunes, but every once in a while I'll try to work something out at home to break it out there and test it on an audience that isn't really listening that closely. So yeah, I've got that, and my big pandemic project was learning a new piece of music notation software. And so to do that, I started transcribing a bunch of stuff, and I transcribed, the big one was a Booker Little album. I got really into his music for a little bit there, and it's a killer band. It's Booker Little and Julian Priester, the local trombone legend, and Eric Dolphy is the front line, so it's kind of Murderer's Row, and there's some really tight, interesting voicings, and so I'm trying to write more sort of sextet, septet kind of stuff, because I really like that sound of 3 or 4 horns. But nothing super imminent. just picking up gigs as they come right now.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go back to college, and your major in college was
Jazz studies. Yeah.
Okay.
So I got a BM in jazz studies, which is just a performance degree, but there's more jazz specific stuff involved with it.
Yeah. And so you were in Michigan, and so after Michigan, what happened? You stayed there for a while, or?
No. Let's see. I graduated in 2004 and got married pretty shortly after that, and we were looking literally all over the world at where we wanted to move. My wife was a dance major, and so we were looking for a city with a good jazz scene and a good dance scene at the same, like modern dance kind of stuff. And we looked seriously all over the world, and ended up just coming back to Seattle because I had some connections here already, and because the dance scene was somewhat interesting to her, and because we didn't really love Michigan all that much. We prefer the weather here and the mountains and the ocean and all that kind of stuff. So we just came straight back here and started picking up as many gigs as I could. Started going to the jam sessions again. This thing was still happening at Tula's on Sunday nights. Owl and Thistle, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, aside from performing and doing these different projects, I know you do sideman work as well. Are there any groups that you're a regular sideman with, or?
Yeah, I play with with Jennifer Kienzle, the singer who's married to Max Wood, the drummer in the grunge project. Yeah. So we play somewhat regularly. Again, that less regularly with the pandemic, and now even less regularly with the fire at Vito's, which is a drag for you as well, I'm sure. Yes. But yeah, that's been the big one. I play actually with Jake Bergevin's band, the Javatown Swing Orchestra. So that was one of my first gigs when I moved back into town, which was pretty funny at first, playing for my band director. But we're more peers now than mentor and mentee anymore. So I play with his group quite a bit. Those are the big ones, I think. Yeah, I just remembered one more project that I did recently that I can tell you about, but I started writing some big band music for Matt Montgomery's publishing company. So Matt Montgomery, the trumpet player and composer, also went to my high school at Mount Lake Terrace, and he has a little publishing company, and they write big band tunes that are like pleasant to listen to and are interesting, but are also like accessible for bands that are not Roosevelt High School or Garfield High School or whatever, because we're kind of, I feel like we have a skewed version of reality up here with how good some of the high school jazz bands are, and that's not the case most places in the country. And so he's found his little niche in the market, I think, and I've written some tunes for him. So I've recently gotten into composing for big band as well, which is an exciting new challenge.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I think the other interesting thing is where we are now here in 2022, aside from what you mentioned. I mean, the pandemic has decimated a lot of these programs, and so you might have, well, we have a drummer and we have horns, or we've got a bassist, so there's not even full bands. So, I mean, charts now have to be, my kind of take on it, and I'm not an authority at all, but I kind of look at big bands as like it's just a combo with more horns. So you have to like see what you can get away with and still make things function when you don't have all the nuts and bolts.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a challenge as a writer, as you're saying.
Yeah, it's tricky, and that was a pretty exciting and challenging kind of brief that I got from Matt for that music, because I like writing complicated. I'm a pianist, and I'm a jazz nerd, and so I like writing complicated, complex harmonic stuff and seeing what I can get away with in that sort of context. And so having to try to write stuff that's that's interesting to listen to, but also has changes that are simple enough that a kid who doesn't know how to play changes can blow over it is it's a cool challenge. So I'm glad I kind of got into that.
Awesome. Well, I want to go back really quickly to when, kind of high school and you're here in Seattle, because it's important for people to know that this just to come in a vacuum. There were a lot of people on the scene before. So I'm curious, when you were going to sessions, you mentioned, John Hanson or Eric Verlinde or Mark Seals, who were all kind of titans of jazz piano here in the Northwest.
Absolutely.
Were there other musicians that you kind of enjoyed watching or going to hear when you were younger that were here playing in Seattle on the scene?
Yeah, so a big one was Floyd Standifer, multi-instrumentalist and sort of legend. He's a great trumpet player, great saxophone player, knew a ton of stuff, and they had a Wednesday night gig at the New Orleans Creole restaurant. Man, I sound old because I'm talking about all of these clubs that don't exist anymore.
I'm older than you, so don't worry about it.
That's cool. But so Wednesday nights at the New Orleans, right? There was that band with it was Clarence Acox and Phil Sparks, and I forget who was playing piano at the time. And Floyd was the front man, and so I would go and see him play, and he would come to that session at Tula's sometimes, and just kind of similar to hanging out with Don Lamphere, just being in the presence of somebody with that much experience, trying to soak that up is good. So Jay Thomas is another one who is maybe the next generation past Floyd, was really influential as well. And then I got to work, Denny Goodhue, I'm sure. I got to work with Denny Goodhue probably at the time that you were at Cornish. He ran some extracurricular sort of jazz ensembles, and I played in an ensemble with him where we played all monk tunes, but they were really obscure monk tunes. So we were playing Trinkle Tinkle and Skippy and some of his tunes that people just don't call at sessions because they're too out there and nobody knows them, So Denny was another big influence on me when I was younger as well. Yeah.
Very cool. I want to go also skip over to you. So education. So now you also teach. I mean, you're running a program. Is it Seattle Pacific?
Seattle Pacific University. I teach the jazz ensemble there, which has been also decimated by the pandemic. But it was running pretty good before that. It's not a big band like a lot of the ensembles around here. So before I got there, it was a big band, but it was supplemented with a bunch of alumni and like local high school kids. I actually played in the ensemble when I was in high school. And then when I took it over, I decided I just wanted to focus on the students that were actually there. And so it's a smaller group. It's anywhere from 6 to 10 students, depending on what quarter it is and who signs up. So I'm doing that as well as teaching like beginning class piano and jazz history and a few other odds and ends like that over there. And I'm also teaching at Bellevue College. Okay. Not doing any jazz stuff there except a jazz history course, but I teach world music there and music technology. Okay. And
is Jim Cisco still there?
Yep.
All
yep.
Right.
He's the jazz guy. So he's doing the jazz ensemble, and they have a combo program there too that's gotten back going pretty nicely since the pandemic, and he's fantastic. And I actually owe a lot of my work that I have now and my development as a musician to Jim, because we in high school I was working at a music shop behind the counter, like a place that rents band instruments or whatever, and he was teaching trumpet lessons in the back. And so we got to know each other there and bonded through our mutual love of jazz music and golf, and started playing a lot of golf together. And so I've gotten a lot of work through Jim.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I know we play a lot with Greg, who's playing with us today, and he's a huge golfer. So there's a huge contingent of Seattle jazz musician golfers.
There's a few of us out there, yeah. Yep. I try and take as much of their money as I can.
Fair enough. All right. Well, I know that there was some unpleasantness, and I'm not going to dig into the politics with the Bellevue jazz program and all that. And people that know, and if you don't, ask somebody, you'll hear all about it. But the program is back and going and supported.
It's back and going, and I don't know how supported it is. I'm adjunct faculty, so I get to like just swoop in and teach my classes and sneak out of there, and not deal with faculty meetings and that kind of stuff where those sorts of decisions are made. But from what I understand, they're looking for alternate sources of funding for the program, and the combo program anyway seems to be going pretty well. They've got pretty good enrollment, and Jim's got them playing some really cool music. Yeah. So
Well, that was the other thing I wanted to ask. So Jim's up there,
Mhm.
you're up there. Is there anyone else on the faculty, music faculty?
There is not any jazz musicians. Who's up there? Matt Jorgensen was there until recently, but he took a full-time job at Shoreline Community College, so he's no longer there. So it's me, it's Jim. There's a great musician named Brian Cobb who runs the theory program there. There's a great musician named Amy Hong who helps. Well, she's actually teaching most of the class piano stuff now and running the choir. So yeah, it's a very small program. You know, over at SPU we've got I think 40-some faculty members, and at Bellevue College it's like 5 or 6 maybe.
Yeah, that was my next question. So who's on the faculty at Seattle Pacific?
So I'm kind of the only jazz guy there. As far as I know, there's a couple of people that are jazz adjacent that play jazz, but that's not their main thing. So Todd Gowers, the bassist, who does a lot of work with Fifth Avenue Theater and whatnot. And Dan Adams is the percussion guy there, who's a fine jazz drum set player, although that's not his main focus. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it for jazz folks.
I've done it again, and I always forget to mention this, but if anybody has any questions for Dan or myself, please put your questions in the comments, and we'll either deal with them in real time, or if we do them after the fact, or can get to them after the fact when this is all done. Are there any questions at this time? Not yet? Okay. All right. Yeah, well, if you have questions, let us know. We'll be happy to answer your questions. Okay, so aside from teaching the programs and working at Bellevue and Seattle Pacific, you also teach private lessons, yes?
I do. I have a really small private studio, and that used to be my main source of income. So I used to teach 30 hours a week of private lessons, and since I've picked up more college work, I've sort of whittled that down to just a few students. I think I have 6 students right now, and I'm only teaching jazz piano, and I'm only teaching high schoolers or really, really motivated middle schoolers. So I just realized at some point I'm not so good with the younger kids. I don't have the right kind of patience.
How does your son feel about that?
Yeah, exactly. I can handle one at a time. I used to teach a lot of group classes with 7 and 8-year-olds, and that was tough for me. A lot of respect for my kid's second grade teacher. I'm wrangling 25 of those kids. Okay. But yeah, so I have a small private studio, and my students are great, and because I've been able to sort of whittle it down to the most motivated kids, they all sound really good, which is nice, and we can work on some more advanced concepts. And yeah, I'm thankful that the ones that I have stuck around through the pandemic. I've only done 2 weeks of lessons in person at the end of this last school year, and the rest for the last 2 years has all been over Zoom, which is, I'm sure you've done some Zoom lessons, and it's probably worse on a wind instrument, honestly, because I'm sure there's a lot of subtleties of tone production and all that get lost over the latency of the internet. But
yeah, it's not ideal. That's for sure.
But for piano, it's been okay. I feel like it's like 70 or 80% good.
Okay. Well, no, I mean that's what I was going to ask. Is number one, if someone wanted to study lessons with you, how could they go about doing that? Let's start with that.
Oh, you can check out my contact information at dankramlich.com. Yeah. And yeah, just shoot me an email. But my phone number's up there, my email's up there. Either way, those are great ways to get a hold of me. And we'll see. I'm always sort of balancing the scales and seeing how many students I want to try to fit into my studio. I have one student actually who was really great, who's graduated this year and is moving on to study not music at Columbia University, and so I'll have a slot in the studio. So yeah, that's the way to do it, is through the website.
And I was going to ask if you do in person or online, but you've already answered that. So
yeah, I'm trying to do. It's hard to find studio space for me, so it all depends on how things go at the colleges that I'm teaching at, with their policies toward that. But I'd like to move back in the fall to in-person lessons.
Okay. Any questions so far? No questions. All right, cool. What was I going to ask you? Yeah, you already answered that too. If someone wanted to get in touch with you about musical transcribing or performing or things like that, all that stuff is on your website, as you mentioned, which is
dankramlich.com.
Yeah.
Yep. And expertly put together by Matt Jorgensen.
And so there's examples of like the Grunge Trio and other
Yep.
projects and things that you're doing.
Just the only audio tracks up there right now are the Grunge Trio, but there's a couple tracks up there from the Grunge Trio with the old personnel with Mark DeFlorio and Chuck Kienzle. And yeah, my contact information is up there. I'm planning eventually on when I get more music written on. I have sort of the back end set up to sell sheet music on there, but I haven't quite done the work to get that on the front end yet.
So like original stuff or transcriptions both or
Original
arrangements?
stuff. So yeah, arrangements, and I have quite a lot of like intermediate level piano music that I've written that I'm trying to get out there because I feel like there's a space for music at that level that's a little more modern than your Clementi and your Mozart minuets and that kind of stuff that might be a little more in the ears of some students that might play it. So I have a lot of music at that sort of intermediate to intermediate advanced level that I've written that I think is pretty fun, and like I said, a little more modern sensibility than most of the stuff that all the kids at that age I was talking about earlier that quit when they're 10 or 11. That's all the stuff that they're playing is the 300-year-old classical stuff.
Well, I have a question for you that maybe, because you've been on the scene and go out to a lot of sessions, and as you mentioned, a lot of the clubs that both of us, either grew up playing in or learning in or have come and gone, and you have a lot of younger students now that are learning how to play. Off the top of your head, any good places where young students can go participate and play and also hear great music in Seattle now?
Yes, I think that a lot of the school programs that are really good have kind of set up their own thing in their communities, like in whatever suburb they happen to be in, right? So before, I think this place closed down too, but I think a few years ago there was a jam session at the Scarlet Tree that was geared toward Roosevelt High School students, although anybody could show up. Out at Mount Si in North Bend, they've got Boxley's where they have weekly jam sessions. I know at Edmonds Woodway, where Jake still teaches, they have a weekly jam session at some pizza joint over there. So those things are happening in those kind of places. As far as Seattle, I think I haven't heard of any all ages sessions that have popped up lately, but I'm hoping. It seems like they pop up for a while and then they go away. So I know before the pandemic, Jay had one at a restaurant on East Lake. I forget what the place was called, but I used to go down there pretty frequently. But yeah, it's pretty tough to find a place that's all ages for the kids to play. But fortunately, I think a lot more band directors now are finding the value in that small group playing for developing improvisational language and just like etiquette and how to get along with other people while you're playing. And so I think there's a lot more of that stuff going on in the schools, which is nice. But I really value the multi-generational sort of aspect of getting out into jam sessions and hearing, learning from elders like we were talking about, like I was able to do with John and Mark and Floyd and people like that. I think the more young people have the opportunity to do that, the better off they'll be. So yes, somebody out there start an all ages jam session.
Yes. Any question? Yes? No? No questions yet? Okay, cool. All right. Well, 2022, you've listened to a bunch of music at this point. Older musicians, younger musicians, and you just mentioned your project with Booker Ervin. In terms of, let's talk piano, because that's your main instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any piano players, either older or current generation, that you're really like, I like their work or checking their stuff out?
Yep, I've been checking out Andrew Hill. He's my favorite musician of this current 3 or 4 month stretch that I'm in right now. So I've been listening to a ton of Andrew Hill's old stuff and trying to dig into mostly his compositions, because I find them really unique and interesting. But his improvisation is great too, and he's got great players on all of his records. So So I've been listening to a lot of Andrew Hill. I'm always listening to Herbie. I keep coming back to his stuff of all eras, so his newer stuff and his stuff from the 60s and everything in between. I listened to a ton of Chick Corea's stuff when he passed away last year. So I'm always going back to that stuff as well. And then somebody that we didn't mention with my experience in college was got to learn from Fred Hersch a lot. And so I'm listening to his. I haven't listened to much of his stuff lately, but I always come back to his music because I just enjoy people that have a unique outlook on the instrument and a unique sound, and I feel like it's harder to get a unique sound on the piano than it is on a lot of other instruments because it's so mechanical, and there's not as much as you can do as with a trumpet or something to change the timbre of the instrument or whatever. And so finding really unique voices on piano is always really interesting to me, and I think Fred has one of those for sure.
Definitely. All right. Well, also similar. 2022. You've had all these experiences with all these musicians. Been all over the world doing all these different things, playing and teaching. If someone were to come to you and they're telling you, I'm considering becoming a musician or having a life as a musician, what are some things that you've learned over the years that you found personally very helpful to you that you would convey to these other people?
Yeah, it's like it's overdone advice, but I think it's true when you first start in any like creative field, is just like try to do everything. Just like say yes to stuff even if you don't think you can do it. I didn't, Matt called me to write some big band stuff. I didn't know if I could write big band stuff, but I tried, and I listened to a bunch of big band stuff, and I looked at a bunch of scores and kind of figured it out, and I think I ended up writing some stuff that sounds pretty good. And that might be a thing that I end up doing a lot more of, so you never know what opportunity is going to come up that's going to get your foot in the door of something that you really enjoy doing, whether it's when I first started, I just thought, well, I'm going to play jazz gigs, and that's going to be my job. But then I ended up teaching a lot more and really enjoying the education process, which I didn't think I would. I didn't think that was a thing that I would be into, but it's a thing that I'm into now. So you never know. And if the worst thing that can happen is like you try something and you don't like it, and you go, okay, well, check that off the list. I'm not going to do that anymore, So yeah, just trying a bunch of stuff. And you can cobble together a career in music. It's hard, but you can totally do it. And I'm glad I had role models when I was younger who proved that to me, because my parents were not really interested in paying for college if I was getting a music degree at first, but then they talked to Ian Alvarez, my private percussion instructor, and they saw, oh, well, he's got a job and he's making money teaching lessons, and he's playing gigs on the side, and like he's pieced this thing together, and it works, and he's got a decent life for himself and for his he has a daughter, and he's able to support her, and like it all works. And there's tons of examples of people like that can like cobble it together and make a fulfilling sort of life in music for themselves. So as long as you get really good at something, whether that's playing the piano or whether it's schmoozing or whether it's writing or production or whatever, like that can open the door for other opportunities. I think.
Excellent advice. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being our guest today. We're going to wrap up the interview here. We're going to take a short pause and then do the concert on this very stage starting at 5 o'clock. So tune back in or come down and join us in person. It's free in all ages. I'm going to be doing a bunch of original music for you today with also Greg Feingel will be joining us on bass and Stefan Schatz on drums. Thank you so much to our sponsors that help make this possible. Of course, that's KNKX, Ted Brown Music, Tacoma Creates, Titus Will Cars, and Edward Jones financial consultant Rick Gray. And, of course, everyone else that comes out to the concerts or joins us online. If you find value in the work that we're doing, most of which throughout the year is 100% free in all ages. Feel free to make a donation online to support us if you'd like. You can do that via Venmo or PayPal or mailing a check, and all that information is at the beginning of the post here. So thank you so much. We'll be right back shortly.